Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the woman should be alone. We will make her a helper as her partner." So out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to the woman to see what she would call them. And whatever the woman called each living creature, that was its name. The woman gave names to all cattle and to birds of the air and to every animal of the field, but for the woman there was not found a helper as her partner. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the woman, and she slept. Then God took one of her ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the woman, God made into a man, and brought him to the woman. Then the woman said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called man, for out of woman this one was taken." Therefore a woman leaves her father and her mother and clings to her husband, and they become one flesh. What if this were what the Bible said? What if the genders were reversed? The traditional passage where man is created first is often used as a justification for patriarchy and sexism. After all, woman is created from the flesh of man, and she is created only to meet the needs of man. Therefore, she's secondary and subordinate. You would think that reversing the genders of the story would fix this problem, that now man would seem like the secondary and subordinate one. I don't know what your experience was just now when I told this reversed story, but when I first read it, I was struck by the way it still sounded sexist to me. Sure, now you have a woman who is empowered to name the animals with authority. That is really awesome. But you also have a God who says, "It is not good that the woman should be alone." Scary thought, right? Are we to believe that a woman is incomplete without a man? That a woman is not okay on her own? That she needs a helper? I'd hate to see what the religious right would do with a verse like that. The reversed story goes on to explain that because of their lack of independence, women leave their parents and cling to their husbands. Great. Now we have biblical support for the argument that all women are clingy. And of course, in this reversed version of the story, man becomes the crowning glory of creation. The world is not complete until man is created. And once man has been created, God sees no reason to try to create anything better. The story is still sexist. But how can that be? If the original story is sexist, the reverse story must be sexist against men, not women. I'm sure that you've spotted the flaw in this line of thinking. Maybe the story itself isn't necessarily sexist. Maybe the sexism we hear in the text is the sexism that we bring to it. I'm convinced that the conscious intent of the author in telling this story was not to advocate for patriarchy, to set up a hierarchy of genders, or even to glorify marriage. This is a text about living in community with one another. It's about our relationality, our finitude, and our shared humanness. In the story, God declares that it is not good for the man to be alone. In other words, the story makes the claim that humans are not built to live in isolation from one another. Now remember that in the story, the man is not a single person who's yet to be married. The man is the only person on earth. He has no human connections and lives in total isolation. This is what God says is not good. People are made for human connection, and we need that connection in order to survive and thrive. Motivated by the need for human connection, God tries again and again to create an adequate partner for the man. God creates birds of the air, cattle, and animals of the field, but none of these creations correspond to the humanness of the man. None of them can be true companions. Finally, God realizes that the only match for humanness is humanness. God realizes that in order to create a companion for the companion must be made of the same substance, the same humanness. Thus, God creates the second human from the substance, the bone, of the first. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This is what the man declares when he finally meets his equal. Of course, the great love stories and love songs of the ages reflect a very similar sentiment. In Emily Bronte's famous book, Wuthering Heights, the protagonist, Kathy Earnshaw, describes her feelings for her love. "He's more myself than I am," she says. "Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." This sense of sameness, of similarity, of kinship is at the heart of romantic love. Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. But of course, the reality is we are all made of the same substance. We have a shared humanness, and we need one another. What do you think would happen if we really recognized this reality? What if every time you walked into a room and saw another human being, you said to yourself, "This person here is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh"? What would that feel like? Would you behave differently? I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and say, "Neighbor, you are bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Let's practice it together first, okay? Just a second, okay? Well, ready? Together. Neighbor, you are bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Good. So now turn to your partner, take turns saying it, and instead of saying neighbor, go ahead and say the person's name. Thank you. I'd like to challenge you to think that sentence to yourself in your head every time you engage with another person this week. Think to yourself, "This person is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." I can tell you that I've tried this exercise, and I must admit that it's hard to remember to do. I do it once and then I forget for a couple of hours. It takes extra time and it takes effort. I also must warn you that this is not a touchy-feely, feel-good exercise. When I read news articles about the city of Baltimore over the past week, this exercise caused me to identify with victims of violence and people of color. It caused me not only to empathize with their pain, but to be invested in the situation. At the same time, I was compelled to identify with white police officers who abuse their power, and my connection to them pained me as well. Our connections make us vulnerable, but they also offer the only avenue for health. In God's grand design, we need healthy connections with one another. Luckily, God has made us of the same substance. It's only when we recognize this shared humanness that we can begin to transform both patriarchy and systemic racism. Sisters and brothers, you are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh.